She walked to the church in the same dress she buried her husband in, hoping for comfort, just one prayer to hold her together. But what she got was rejection. Cast out in the rain, heartbroken, humiliated, no one knew what that woman would become. Years later, they would beg to have her back. But she didn't need their doors anymore. She had built her own sanctuary from the pain they gave her. In a small southern town bordered by aging oaks and rusting fences, where the hymns of Sunday mornings often masked the cruelty of tight-lipped judgment, lived a black widow named Ruth Ann Holloway. She wasn't old, perhaps in her late 30s, but grief made her look 10 years older. The loss of her husband, Marvin, a respected carpenter, had come suddenly. One day he was fixing doors for neighbors and greeting strangers with his usual gentle nod, and the next he was coughing up blood in a hospital room she couldn't afford. Within weeks, the cancer consumed him like a fire in dry brush, and just like that, Ruth Ann was alone. The town didn't offer much to begin with. Dusty sidewalks, corner stores that opened when they wanted, and people who saw everything but spoke only when it was safe. Ruth Ann had always been quiet, a background figure in community gatherings. But with Marvin gone, the silence that followed wasn't just internal. It became a wall others refused to cross. Widows were often pitied, yes, but not when they were black, broke, and without children. In towns like theirs, superstition clung to tradition like old paint on a rotting fence. Rumors began to whisper that Ruth Ann's misfortune was punishment, that she must have done something to deserve it. She became invisible in broad daylight. Every Sunday she had still walked to church, not because she believed the rumors would disappear, but because it was the one place she had always found peace. She clutched the same worn Bible Marvin had gifted her on their 5th anniversary, its cover cracked and spine tired, but still whole. But that particular morning the air was heavy, thick with storm clouds and something unspoken. The church bell rang, but it didn't sound like welcome. It felt more like warning. Ruth Ann arrived just as the congregation was settling. The church stood tall in its whitewashed glory, a proud building with stained glass windows that never quite reflected the truth within. She climbed the steps slowly, her breath catching with each one, not from exertion but from the weight of uncertainty. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. The music that filled the sanctuary dimmed under the hush of disbelief. She took her usual place in the back pew, her presence making shoulders stiffen and glances exchange. The pews ahead were filled with pressed suits and floral dresses, but there was a coldness in the air that no velvet cushion could soften. The pastor, a man of booming voice and polished shoes, stood at the pulpit, sermon pages rustling in his hand. He paused when he saw her. The room seemed to hold its breath. Moments passed, then words, and those words were not of grace, nor mercy, nor compassion. They were of exclusion. Ruth Ann's presence, he claimed, was a disturbance, that certain spirits were best left outside the house of the Lord. He said it calmly, without fire or fury, as though he were reading out the weather. The congregation didn't protest. Some nodded, some simply stared, and some, who had once eaten at her table when Marvin was alive, looked away. She didn't fight. She didn't speak. She only stood. The world around her blurred like a smudged painting as she made her way back down the aisle, her feet echoing against the wooden floor. The same church that had baptized her, buried her parents, and witnessed her wedding vows now expelled her without shame or hesitation. Outside, the storm broke. Rain fell like judgment, soaking her dress, washing over her skin as though to cleanse what the church would not. She didn't seek shelter. She walked home, every step pressing into the wet gravel road, every drop of water mingling with the tears she refused to shed in front of them. Her house waited like a loyal friend, small, tired, but still standing. Inside, she lit a candle and sat by the window, watching the downpour blur the world beyond. She wasn't angry. Anger would have been too easy. She wasn't even surprised. She felt something deeper, a kind of betrayal that settles into the marrow. The place she had turned to in her lowest moment had slammed its doors shut and handed her shame on a silver plate. She sat for hours, unmoving, a statue of sorrow. Her Bible lay unopened beside her, the flame of the candle flickering with quiet resilience. In the days that followed, no one came to check on her. No casseroles, no calls. The same people who once smiled on Sundays now crossed the street when they saw her coming. Her name became a ghost, spoken only behind curtains or in whispers during potlucks. She was a walking cautionary tale, an example of what happens when sorrow outstays its welcome. But inside her, something had begun to shift. The rejection didn't break her, it crystallized her. She realized that if there was any salvation to be found, it would not come from pews or pulpits, but from within. The storm outside had passed, but a new one began to stir inside Ruth Ann, one not made of grief or guilt, but of purpose. And so she rose from her chair, dried her soaked Bible, and wrote on the last page something simple. Let them regret the day they turned me away. Not a curse, not a threat, a promise. Not to them, but to herself. After the rain had washed the streets and silence settled over the town, Ruth Ann Holloway began to move with a rhythm that no longer relied on approval. There were no apologies to offer, no explanations to give. She had been made into a ghost while still breathing, and she understood then that to survive, she had to stop waiting to be seen. Her days became disciplined. She rose before the sun, washed her face in cold water, and swept the porch of her late husband's modest home. Marvin had built the small cottage with his own hands, every nail a testament to his quiet strength. Now it stood as her only inheritance, her only defense against the emptiness the world insisted she carry. But Ruth Ann did not mourn aloud. She let her silence grow teeth. With the little money she had saved, she began roasting peanuts on a borrowed coal stove she set up at the back of her yard. Her fingers burned and blistered, but she didn't flinch. She sold the peanuts in old paper wraps, walking to the market each morning to sit under a sagging umbrella. Most people passed without looking at her. A few tossed coins her way, but even their kindness carried the tone of pity. Still, she sat. Over time, she added other things: boiled corn, fried dough, palm oil soap made from her grandmother's long-forgotten recipe. Her fingers became tough and quick. Her feet learned to move through spaces where her presence was unwanted. She built her business like one builds a wall, quietly, one brick at a time. And while the town still refused to say her name in public, her goods started showing up in their kitchens. Her silence became her power. In the stillness of her nights, she wrote ideas in a notebook she kept beside her bed. Business plans, names of widows she had seen on the street, women who, like her, had been discarded, grieving in silence, ignored in public. She started inviting them to her backyard one by one. They came hesitantly at first, afraid, ashamed, skeptical. Ruth Ann didn't offer sermons. She gave them soap molds, buckets, herbs, and space to breathe. It began as survival. It became a movement. Women began to gather in her yard after dusk, long after their chores were done and their families were asleep. Some came with babies on their backs, others with faces still bruised from the world's unfair hands. They made things: soap, baskets, beaded jewelry, but more than that, they made community. Ruth Ann said little, but her presence anchored them. She taught by example, by motion, by resilience. The church remained quiet. The pastor never spoke of her again from the pulpit, and her name stayed absent from the Sunday bulletin. But the pews began to thin. Families who once worshipped faithfully every Sunday found reasons to stay home. The prayers began to sound hollow. People whispered of Ruth Ann's backyard, of the women who gathered there, of the healing that didn't come from oil or song, but from work, sweat, and shared sorrow. One afternoon, a young woman from a neighboring town knocked on Ruth Ann's door. She had heard of a place where broken women stitched dignity into cloth and carved strength into soap. She asked if she could stay. Ruth Ann gave her a blanket and a seat without hesitation. And then another came, and another. Soon her yard was too small for what it had become. With money saved in a rusted tin and help from the very women society tried to erase, she bought an empty plot of land on the edge of town. They cleared it together, cut down the weeds, hammered wood, carried stones in their arms like babies. They built it with their own hands, a 2-room workshop with wide windows, shelves of supplies, and a sign painted in gold that read, "The House of Golden Dignity." It wasn't just a name. It was a declaration. Here, they didn't ask what you had lost. They asked what you wanted to build, and build they did. The women made products that traveled beyond the town, sold in nearby villages, and even as far as the city. A few volunteers offered to teach them bookkeeping and marketing. Some women returned to school. Others, once voiceless, began to speak in front of groups, telling their stories not as tragedies, but as testimonies. Ruth Ann remained at the center, never raising her voice, never seeking praise. She walked among them like a mother in a sea of daughters, tending, encouraging, pushing quietly from behind. Her home became a sanctuary, her hands a blueprint, her silence a language of transformation. And yet not once did she walk past the church again. She didn't need to. For Ruth Ann understood now that faith wasn't confined to stained glass or pulpits. It lived in soil, in effort, in unthanked hands. The world had told her she was cursed. She had answered by blessing others. One evening, as the sun folded behind the trees and the lanterns in the workshop glowed with warmth, she stood alone at the edge of her garden, watching the women laugh and work. There were no pews, no choir, just hope, sewn into every corner of that place. And for the first time in years, Ruth Ann smiled, not out of pride, but peace. She had never needed the church to be whole. Time has a quiet way of exposing what pride attempts to conceal. As the weeks turned to months, the rhythms of the town began to shift like tides pulled by an unseen moon. The once crowded pews of Trinity Chapel started to empty, slowly, subtly, like a leaking roof unnoticed until the ceiling caved in. At first, it was the younger families who stopped coming, citing work or illness. Then the older women began choosing to worship from home. The absences multiplied until they could no longer be ignored. The pastor, Reverend Albert Rowe, a man who once moved sermons with fire and thunder, began to feel the chill in the sanctuary. The echo of his voice grew louder as the room grew emptier. Where once he'd needed a microphone to reach the back pews, now his voice met only the air and a few scattered amens. His words, once drenched in authority, now carried the dry weight of routine. Something was shifting, and he didn't know how to stop it. Outside the church walls, something else was rising. The House of Golden Dignity, tucked away on the edge of town, had grown into more than a workshop. It had become a sanctuary, not of hymns and sermons, but of healing, purpose, and truth. Women who had once been silent were now confident, self-sufficient. They no longer looked to the church for guidance because they had found leadership in one of their own. People talked, though not in open accusation. They spoke in cautious admiration, whispers in barber shops, conversations behind fruit stands. Someone would mention Ruth Ann Holloway and another would nod slowly, recalling how she'd helped deliver a baby when the midwife was unavailable, or donated handmade soap to the hospital. Her name, once heavy with scorn, now carried weight of another kind, one rooted in respect. The irony wasn't lost on the town. The woman who had been thrown out in the rain had become the very soul of their community. Her hands had touched more lives in one season than the church had in years, and while she never spoke of the past refused to forget her. Children who once sat in Sunday school now sat in Ruth Ann's workshop, learning how to mold clay and braid raffia into baskets. Widows who had once been ashamed of their status now wore it like armor, teaching others the trades they had learned from her. Some townspeople found themselves quietly buying their soap and candles from the shop's small wooden display at the local general store, pretending not to notice Ruth Ann's name stamped on the packaging. The church could no longer pretend she didn't exist. The silence became unbearable. One morning, Reverend Rose summoned the church elders to a meeting. The sanctuary was cool, the air thick with attention they all pretended not to notice. He opened with a prayer, but even his voice trembled as he spoke. The subject, though unspoken, hung in the room like smoke. Ruth Ann Holloway. What had been done? What had not been undone? He asked questions, rhetorical and real. Had they judged too harshly? Had they forgotten compassion in pursuit of order? The room remained silent. Not out of guilt, most were not yet brave enough to feel that, but because the truth was slowly becoming undeniable. What they had cast out had returned, not in vengeance, but in vision, and their own influence was beginning to crumble under the weight of their pride. Later that week, an invitation was extended to Ruth Ann by the town council, not from the church, but from the civic committee that oversaw the annual harvest celebration. They asked if she would be willing to speak at the gathering. It was a tradition for the pastor to give the closing blessing, but this year, the people wanted her voice. Not to replace the pastor, but to stand alongside the town's leaders as a symbol of what had grown from rejection. Ruth Ann, now accustomed to being needed but never celebrated, accepted with grace. She didn't ask why. She didn't seek to understand whether it was gratitude, guilt, or genuine change. She only prepared her heart and wore her finest dress, a modest gown in gold and brown that she had sewn herself. Her hair was neatly braided, her skin glowing with the sheen of someone who had worked hard and never waited for validation. The day of the harvest arrived with clear skies and laughter in the air. Stalls of fresh produce lined the square. Children ran with painted faces, and the smell of roasted yams filled the breeze. When it came time for the speeches, the crowd gathered around the stage. Ruth Ann was introduced simply as a woman who embodies resilience. There were no titles, no apologies, just her name and a quiet hush of anticipation. She stepped forward and stood before them, not as a victim or outcast, but as a living testament. Her voice, though soft, carried across the crowd. She spoke not of pain or injustice, but of rebuilding. She spoke of hands, how they could destroy or heal. She spoke of women, how they bloom when watered with respect. She spoke of faith, not the kind bound in pews, but the kind forged in fire. The crowd stood still, many blinking back tears. When she finished, they didn't clap. They stood. The entire square, silent and standing. And for the first time in public, her name was spoken without shame, without rumor, only reverence. Reverend Rose sat quietly in the front row, hands folded. He had no sermon to follow that. His church had fallen silent, not because it was empty, but because its spirit had been found elsewhere. And as Ruth Ann stepped down from the stage, the town she once walked through like a shadow now opened before her, not just with welcome, but with understanding. The seasons rolled forward, and with them, Ruth Ann Holloway's legacy deepened into the roots of the town. What began as whispered admiration evolved into quiet reverence. The woman who once sat beneath the heavy judgment of others now stood as a symbol of what dignity looks like when it rises from dust. Not loud, not vengeful, but steady, golden, and immovable. The House of Golden Dignity expanded beyond its original walls. It had started as a 2-room workshop built by hands bruised from exclusion. Now it included a reading space, a childcare corner, and a garden where herbs, vegetables, and wildflowers grew together in rows that defied convention. The land was no longer just a place for widows to earn. It became a space for healing, learning, and community. People who once kept their distance began bringing donations, volunteering hours, and more importantly, sending their daughters. Ruth Ann herself remained unchanged by recognition. She still swept her own porch, still tied her headscarf tightly when cooking soap, and still answered every knock at her door. She accepted no praise as hers alone. When asked about her strength, she pointed to the others, The women who rose beside her, who shared in the burden and the harvest. It wasn't just her victory, it was theirs. Eventually, reporters came, first from nearby towns, then from the city. They were drawn not by scandal or spectacle, but by the quiet wonder of it all. A community of women built from the cast-offs of society, creating value from the very things they were told made them worthless. Photos of the House of Golden Dignity appeared in newspapers beside headlines that marveled at the transformation. Widow's Workshop becomes beacon of hope. From shame to strength, Ruth Ann's legacy lives in her people. Through all this, Ruth Ann never returned to Trinity Chapel. She didn't need to. What she had found in silence, the church could not offer in sound. She had discovered that sacredness lives in places people don't expect, in healing herbs, in calloused palms, in soft laughter among survivors. Her faith had evolved, not lost, not abandoned, just rooted in a soil richer than judgment. But time, as always, is both giver and taker. Ruth Ann grew older. Her knees stiffened in the morning. Her hands, once swift and precise, slowed with age. She never spoke of her weariness. She continued to teach, to guide, to light lanterns when the power failed. But those closest to her could see it. The woman whose shoulders carried a community was preparing to rest. One crisp autumn morning, the town awoke to news that Ruth Ann Holloway had passed quietly in her sleep. She had gone the way she had lived, without spectacle, without complaint, with grace. The reaction was immediate and profound. The church bell tolled not just from Trinity Chapel, but from every steeple in the county. Shops closed, schools canceled classes, candles were lit on porches. Even those who had never met her felt the weight of her absence. She had not sought greatness, but she had become great. A memorial service was held in the town square by unanimous request. The elders who had once refused to acknowledge her were now the ones placing flowers at her feet. Women she had mentored spoke of her in trembling voices. Young girls who had never known exclusion because of Ruth Ann's efforts read poems in her honor. One after another, people came forward to speak, not of charity, but of transformation. She had not simply fed the hungry or taught the poor. She had rewritten what dignity meant. Then something remarkable happened. The very church that once turned her away opened its doors. Reverend Rowe, now old and quiet with wisdom hard-earned, insisted the final rites be performed inside Trinity Chapel. There was no argument. There was no protest. Ruth Ann's body, dressed in a soft golden gown, was carried through the town and into the sanctuary that once rejected her. And for the first time, the church was full. Not just with bodies, but with humility. The ceremony was simple. There were no grand eulogies, only reflections, and in the middle of it all stood her Bible, the same worn one she had clutched on the day she was turned away. Its spine was still cracked, but its pages had grown heavy with time and truth. It rested on the pulpit, not as a token, but as a lesson. That day, a plaque was unveiled at the entrance of Trinity Chapel. It read, "In honor of Ruth Ann Holloway, a woman of golden dignity, may this house never again cast out the heart of God." From that day on, the church changed, not because of guilt, but because it had been shown a better way. Widows were welcomed, the poor were honored, and sermons softened into truth. Ruth Ann's name was spoken like a hymn. But even more than that, the House of Golden Dignity continued. It was not buried with her. It lived in every woman who stood taller because of her. Every child who believed their worth was not defined by wealth or applause. Years later, when people spoke of Ruth Ann, they did not speak of the day she was cast out. They spoke of everything that followed. Her golden dignity was not a result of the injustice she faced, but the way she rose in spite of it. She didn't just forgive, she transcended. She didn't just survive, she created a sanctuary from her scars. She had entered history not through protest, but through purpose. And in the quiet corner of the garden behind the house she built, under a simple stone etched with her name, the flowers she planted still bloom, bright, wild, and free.